Truebe, sorry. She joined Sky Island Alliance in 2021, where she focuses primarily on a community science program called Spring Seeker, and is also responsible for habitat restoration in Sky Island watersheds. She earned her PhD from the University of Arizona, where her major research interests included monsoons, fire, drought, caves, climate vulnerability, hydrology, and science and society. Wow, awesome. Her childhood experiences inspired her love of the desert Southwest. Growing up in Tucson, Arizona, watching monsoon cumulonimbus clouds form over saguaros and prickly pear, listening to curve-billed thrashers and cactus wrens chatter every morning, and playing in the dirt under the mesquite trees in her backyard. Wow, that sounds nice. I'm loving this. So without further ado, speaking to us about Sky Islands of the Desert Southwest, let's welcome Dr. Sarah Truebe. Give you the floor.
Thank you. I don't remember where I got that bio from, but thanks for sharing that with everyone. I am a very proud Sonoran Desert resident since very young, well, since I was born. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and let's make sure that that will work. Oh, PowerPoint disappeared. I'm so sorry, folks. Give me just a second to re-find PowerPoint, which obviously quit when I started Teams.
You are totally fine. And if you need to, you can always just send me a copy, and I don't mind going through them on my screen either.
Nope, I think I clicked something funny there. I'm sorry. We even practiced this. This is just one of those things that, you know,
for a moment there.
I don't understand where PowerPoint went. So you did see that for a second?
I did, yes.
All right, we can try that again.
Is that
full screen for everybody?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah. Good. I'm glad that worked. I'm sorry about that delay, folks. All right, so I am delighted to talk to you today about the Sky Islands of the Desert Southwest. When we did our introductions just then, I heard a couple folks that are here from Arizona who are probably slightly familiar already with our Sky Island region or very familiar. But for those of you that aren't, I will talk a little bit about what Sky Island Alliance, my organization, is and does, then more about the Sky Island region in general. I'm also going to focus a little bit on my particular program, which is the Spring Seeker program, and how springs are important within these Sky Islands. And then I hopefully will have a little bit of time for discussion and just kind of thinking about ways that my alliance can work more with your alliance, focused on plant conservation in this region. So to start us off, Sky Island Alliance, this organization, our mission is to protect and restore the diversity of life and lands in the Sky Island region of the US and Mexico, and I'll show a map on that in a little bit. And we work to ensure that the Sky Islands are a place where nature thrives, open space and clean water are available to all, and people are connected to the region and its capacity to enrich our lives. So we do that work through a number of different ways. Our main focus areas are water, wildlife, people, and then collaborative stewardship. So for water, we study, protect, and enhance water sources like springs and streams. For wildlife, we have a number of programs that are focused on assessing where wildlife are on the landscape and then how we can enhance habitat connectivity there. For people, we have a number of programs both through direct volunteering as well as community science programs where people can connect with and care for the Sky Island region. And then we do take the alliance part of our name really seriously, and we partner with so many different entities to be able to do our work. Some of our partners, for example, include federal agencies, state agencies, local governments, private landowners, academic institutions, various experts and practitioners, other partner conservation organizations, and private foundations. And we really would not be able to do the work without working together with everyone. It's really, our organization has about 13 people, and we're trying to work in a huge area. So definitely capitalizing, it's not quite the right word, but working together with all of these different partners is the way that we can achieve what we really want to see here for the Sky Island region. And of course, I have already mentioned this, but we have an army of volunteers. In the last year, I want to say, I think we had Something like 347 volunteers help us for 8,000 hours. And mind you, this is a pandemic, and so we're not even as active as we have been, although thankfully we're starting to increase that again. And so we are just absolutely delighted by all of our volunteers that work with us on a variety of different projects. Okay, so I want to talk more about the Sky Island region as a whole. So this language may not be familiar to everybody, but the word Sky Island refers to mountain ranges that rise up from our desert grassland seas. And this was actually a term that was coined by some naturalists in the area, but it has kind of stuck because if you're standing on top of a sky island and you look out, it really does look like these little island mountain tops that are arising from the desert that surrounds them. This is a region of 55 different mountain ranges, and you can see the image on the left there has Tucson kind of in the upper left corner there, and then Phoenix, if you're more familiar with where that is, would kind of be off the upper left corner of the map entirely. And this is just a map that shows all of the different mountain ranges that we have in this region, spanning all the way down to central Sonora. And you can see Hermosillo is the bottom left corner of that map. And so that's kind of the region that we're talking about. Just some more images. I have some images and some other pieces coming up that kind of highlight what region we're talking about here. So here's an example where you can see our desert grassland seas and then the mountains arising from that. So biotically speaking, this region is particularly interesting because we get influence from all of these different parts of the North American continent. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Southern Arizona, we actually have a monsoon here. We have a almost tropical rain pattern that occurs over the summer, most summers. In 2020, we didn't really have one, but in 2021, we had one of the best ones in 30 or more years. So we have this monsoon kind of influence. We have a lot of species that are migrating north and south through this region. And so we have influences, biotically speaking, from the Sonora Desert, Rocky Mountain region, the Great Plains and Chihuahuan Desert, the Sierra Madre down in Mexico, as well as the neotropics. One of the things that I wanted to highlight for folks who maybe aren't familiar with this region is that because we have these mountain islands and they have this great range of elevation diversity, that's why we have so many different biomes, and it is actually a huge biodiverse hotspot here on the planet. So here's just an example, kind of a schematic of what our mountain islands look like, spanning from desert scrub down here at the bottom, all the way up through fir forest in some cases. And actually yesterday I was in the Catalina Mountains, which are to the north of Tucson. And there are, despite, there was a huge fire there in 2020 called the Bighorn Fire. And despite that big fire being there, we were walking through some fir trees even up there still. There are a few spots that survived. And so it's just a remarkable, I'm down here in the desert right now giving this talk from Tucson, Arizona. But yesterday I was all the way up in fir forest. And some people have compared this to traveling between Mexico and Canada, but instead of going spatially, you're going up elevation. And here's just another diagram of that shows the differences between the different islands, depending on if you're further south, like the Huachuca Mountains on the right there, it might not pop all the way up into that fir forest, but the Pinaleños, which is more to the northern part of the Sky Island region, it does have some of that type of forest habitat on the top of the mountains, but then it still goes all the way down to desert scrub. And I stole this super old diagram from a paper, but it just is starting to highlight how we have, because we have this range of elevation habitats, we do have a huge number of species, and the more elevation range there is, the more species are present there. This is the only place in the world. Usually I have to qualify things and say it's one of the only, it's one of the, but actually this is the only place in the world where jaguar and black bear live together in the same habitats. We have wildlife cameras across the region. We have seen jaguars here in the northern part of the Sky Island region in Arizona, in the same habitats that we're seeing black bear, which is just a really cool combination of species. We have a wide range of bird species. Some estimates say as many as half the bird species you can find in North America at some time or another move through the Sky Island region. Something like 120 different and so I learned a lot more about bats as well, and we're also a bat biodiversity hotspot here. This whole region is designated critical habitat for jaguar, as well as other sensitive species like jericho and leopard frogs, northern Mexican garter snakes, and Mexican long-tongued bats. And so this region is just hugely biodiverse, and I promise I'm getting to plants in a moment. I've found that most people get really excited about wildlife first, and so we usually start there. So as an example, this whole region is known to harbor all of this biodiversity, and particularly there may be some spots that are hopefully some climate refugia, although of course as temperatures change and those habitat boundaries migrate uphill, it's less likely that those sites will actually survive. We could talk more about that later. And for those of you, I just had to include a picture of a coati. Once again, I know that we're talking about plants, but we have coati here, which are this remarkable, they look like some combination of a monkey and a I don't even know particularly how to describe them if you haven't seen them. But coati are abundant in our region, especially around our water sources. And this is just a fun picture of a mountain lion. All right, so now let's talk more about plants. So our region is known for having more than 4,000 different species of native plants, and that includes many endemics as well as species on the edges of their ranges, because we're in this area that is affected by all of these different biotic communities. And related to that are pollinators. In one of our Sky Islands alone, the Chiricahua Mountains, which are close to the eastern border of Arizona with New Mexico, we have more than 500 species of bees, and we also have, I can't remember the name of the preserve, but we have a place that is highlighted, I think, for having up to 1,000 species of bees. It's a little bit further south, closer to the border. 60 species of butterflies, 14 species of hummingbirds, and 21 species of bats just in that one mountain range. And a lot of that is because species are migrating through, but it also is just the wide range of habitats available to them. As I mentioned, I work mostly on our springs program. And so springs have an additional, they tend to be very biodiverse in this already very biodiverse region. Some threats to the region include Arizona has one of the most rapidly warming spring seasons in the US. And I think that's also true south of the border, but the data that we have right now is for Arizona. It's anticipated there'll be an increase in aridity, which can be a challenge for a lot of these habitats. Winter precipitation has already been shown to be more variable, where we have some winters like this winter that's just super dry. We're about 1.5 inches under our regular rainfall, and we only get about 6 inches of rainfall usually in winter. And then, of course, this all leads to changes in bloom time and species migrations and mismatches in the timing for various different species. So I want to talk a little bit more about some of what Sky Island is doing, and then I'll transition into talking about springs in particular. So this is another vision of the Sky Island region. We've actually emitted the border wall because that's what we would like to see to be able to help wildlife and plant communities migrate more freely across that border, and of course also people. But we have a number of different programs throughout the region that I'd love to talk about next. To the very far north, sort of in the very, very tippy north of the Sky Island region, we have a project in Aravaipa Canyon. This is a stretch of a river that actually has year-round water flow, even though it's a fairly low elevation desert site. I was actually just there on Sunday, and it's remarkable to go from arid, typical desert. You hike downhill for a 1/4 mile, and then all of a sudden you're wading in this river. And that's true any time of year that you go there, there's always water there. And one of the projects that we're doing there actually centers on the invasive periwinkle plant, which was brought in by people who were settling on the western side of the, I'm sorry, I got my directions wrong, eastern side of the Aravaipa Canyon Preserve. And so we've been working for a number of years to remove vinca and then to replant some native plants. And so here are some volunteers who are all working to remove the vinca, and you can see that some of them are standing right there in that beautiful river. And then, of course, replanting and supporting the rehabilitation of those communities there. We're also doing some work in the Galuro Mountains, which are shown in kind of the center of the image on the right. And this is a property where we had some folks decide that they wanted to purchase an old cattle ranch and turn it into kind of this this little spot of wilderness. But of course, they're having to work through the history of that land, and that includes a lot of gully incision that has been occurring because of the history of cattle on that land. And so what we've been doing in that location is building erosion control structures like this one here. This was previously a head cut that would have kept moving upstream, but we armored it with rock materials so that it allows the water to make that elevation transition without continuing to eat away at the landscape around it. And there's a number of different types of projects that we have that are in the erosion control arena. And here's just some examples of volunteers working on those rock structures, which you can see kind of the lighter colored pinkish rock in these sections. Okay, but now I want to talk about the program that I'm involved with the most, which is the Spring Seeker program. So this map that I'm showing here is once again of the Sky Island region, and every red dot there is a spring that has been visited by one of our volunteers or staff. We're actually up to 671 springs visited in the region. We know of about 6,000 springs on the U.S. side of the border, but we suspect there's just as many in the Sonoran side, and we just don't know where they are yet. And so the reason we used to have a program called Adopt a Spring, where people would go out and take very detailed measurements at a specific spring. But it was only giving us eyes on about 5 or 6 sites across the whole region, and being able to instead send volunteers to many, many more of these locations. It's allowed us to use some of the data to decide where to do restoration work. And we already have used the data to initiate projects in Sonora, project in the Catalinas, in the Huachuca Mountains, as well as the Whetstone Mountains. So that's 4 different Sky Islands that we're able to now do some restoration work in because of data that was submitted by volunteers. So I got really deep on this one slide. I promise I have more explaining this more in detail. But I do want to take one step back real quick and talk about what is a spring, because a lot of folks have been to a spring and maybe haven't put all the pieces of that together. So spring is anywhere that groundwater emerges at the surface. So usually water is moving underground through some permeable layer, it hits some impermeable layer, and then it takes the path of least resistance, which happens to be to emerge at the surface. And a lot of the pictures that you'll see have a backpack in them, because we ask our volunteers to put down their backpack for scale, so that we know kind of the scale of what we're looking at. About 60 to 70% of springs in our region are streambed or riocrene springs. I like to remember that word because rio sounds like river in Spanish. And so that helps me remember that that's the type of springs that we have in these stream beds. Luckily, based on the way that Arizona is currently interpreting the Surface Water Protection Program from Waters of the United States, it seems like many of our riocrene springs, if they connect to traditionally navigable waters, actually do have some protection. But our other types of springs don't necessarily have that protection because they are not connected in that way. Of course, they're very important for wildlife because in some cases they're very far away from other rivers and lakes. But we're still working on figuring out what that is looking like here, at least in Arizona. So these are riocrene springs, they're stream bed springs. Our next most common type of spring are hill slope springs, and these are ones where the water is emerging on the side of a hill. An example of that on the far left, McGrew Spring, is actually one of the places that we are doing some cattle fencing. Right now that site is invaded by rabbit's foot grass and horehound, and it's very trampled, but we just got permission to go in there, clear the invasive species, replace the exclusion fencing, and then hopefully we'll be able to see that site as it develops, surveying the plant community there once we exclude cattle. Our next most common spring type is actually a cienega or wet meadow or a swamp type spring. So these tend to be often you'd imagine them as kind of alpine meadows, so really high elevation sites. But we actually have quite a few there at low elevation as well, especially along some of our river valleys. And so those are pretty neat sites, and they can be really important for endemic species, especially at those low elevation locations where they're kind of these wet spots in this desert. And then there's so many other different ways that water can emerge from the ground, depending upon where you are in your area. You might have more or less of these different types of springs, but I just wanted to share that because I think springs are really cool, and maybe that will help y'all take a look at the springs in your area and kind of think about how the water is coming out at the surface. So regionally, springs are particularly important here in Arizona and Mexico because they are places with water. And in many cases, they're the only places with year-round water because we don't have all the rivers and lakes that are located in some of the other parts of the US. We find a lot of riparian plants and animals at these sites, including a number of endemic species. And then, of course, springs are important for recreation, human and livestock uses. We see a lot. You can go out there to the middle of nowhere. You can spend 14 hours bushwhacking to a spring site, and then all of a sudden there's a 15-foot tank and a bunch of concrete, and you're wondering how did people get out here? What were they doing? How were they using this spring site in the past? And then, of course, there's thousands of years of history of people using springs regionally that we're trying to get a better eye on and understand kind of the importance of these sites to people as well. And then there's some evidence that springs are acting as climate refugia. So as climate changes, because there's a little bit more water at those sites, as it becomes more arid, generally speaking, sites can actually hold on a little bit longer and species can hold on a little bit longer. We're also definitely noticing that during fire and then after fire, springs are really important. During fire, just that little bit of extra moisture can prevent a severe kind of canopy scale burn at some of those spring sites. And I mentioned already the bighorn fire in the Catalinas. That fire burned 120,000 acres. And we are starting to see regrowth now. And it turns out that most of that regrowth is focusing around springs first, because, of course, that extra water is allowing the species to bounce back quicker. And I do have a little caveat in there. We actually also are interested in any water in the desert, even a human-made stock tank. A lot of those stock tanks, especially closer to the border where there's a lot more cattle, as long as they're the stock ponds themselves are excluded from cattle, and maybe that water pipes over to a trough for the livestock to be able to access, those ponds can actually be really important habitat for some of our native and endangered frogs. I do also want to share, there's a really cool project going on right now in Saguaro National Park, the eastern part of it, on these springs that are called tinajas, which means large earthen jar in Spanish. And they're finding that these tinajas kind of hold on to the water a little bit longer, and that they even have tried to empty some of them, and then they test the water that comes back into them, and they are groundwater dominated. So these are really important drinking spots for wildlife, and once again provide that opportunity for water to be on the landscape longer. So I do just want to also share a couple of fun photos from springs. We have a number of cameras out. We actually have a large study called the Border Wildlife Study, where we have cameras on a grid looking at wildlife use in and around springs, in and around the border. But we also have some cameras on springs, and we see a lot of different species coming into springs. So things like coati, mountain lions. We have 4 different species of skunks here in the Sky Islands. So a lot of these spring sites are really important to bring in wildlife, as I've kind of been saying. But we're here to talk about plants. And so I do want to share with you some plant highlights. We have I'll post this link in the chat right after the talk. I have a couple of links that I want to share with everybody. But we had an excellent talk by Dan Beckman of the National Park Service, who he is almost single-handedly, with the help of a couple of interns, cataloging spring sites in the Rincon Mountains to the east of Tucson. And these spring sites, many of them we haven't seen for a while or we never knew about, but some of them were developed in the past. In any case, he's going and actually doing a plant biotic assessment at each of those sites, and he's found a number of really exciting plants. I'm going to share this with you now. They are screen grabs from his excellent talk, which I recommend you watch. Because I think that he's the expert on all of these, but they're pretty cool. So I'll go ahead and share them now. So there's a spring called Scarlet Spring, which is the only Rincon locale for the scarlet monkey flower. And it seems like that's even a separate subspecies of the Arizona big red monkey flower. It's known from a couple other mountain ranges in the northern part of the range here, but apparently at Scarlet Spring, it is just everywhere. Some other rare plants that are found at Scarlet Spring include the gray leaf red raspberry, fringed willowherb, and red baneberry. Once again, any of the plants that that Dan shared in his talk are ones that we don't find very commonly in the Sky Islands. In some cases, this is the one location, one or two locations that they're found. Thurber's bog orchid is a cool one. So this was collected in the rincons in the 1890s, but it was not seen again until 2018. And so this is only known from one spring in the rincons. It's pretty common down in Mexico from what Dan shared, but it's very rare in the US. And so seeing it in the rincons is pretty cool. Also, my cat is so excited about the Thurber's bog orchid that she is going to come over here and start meowing at me about it. So I apologize for that in the background. Okay, so we also have the largest native fern in North America is found at springs in the Rincon Mountains, which is pretty exciting, particularly locally abundant at Turkey Creek Spring, but it's not known from anywhere else in the Rincons. And so this is pretty rare in the Sky Island region, but like I said, we're finding it at this one site in the Rincons, which is pretty exciting. Thinleaf alder is another site. It's the southern range limit of this primarily Rocky Mountain species. So like I mentioned before, the different biotic influences in the Sky Island region include the Rocky Mountains. And this is one example of one plant that has made it all the way this far south. This dogwood species is also fairly rare, but was found at a spring in the Rincons. Virginia strawberry. And this Pipsissewa, which I think is beautiful, and I would love to go see this. I would love to be able to see this plant at a spring or anywhere, honestly. But this is another example that is very rare in the Sky Islands, only known historically from the Chiricahuas and then known in the Penaleños now. So that's pretty exciting as well. So I'm not a plant person yet. I'm working on it. So I apologize that those are not my photos or my story, but I really do hope you'll take a look at Dan's talk, which is on our website. And like I said, I'll post that link when I'm done speaking and I can see the chat again. And I just wanted to talk a little bit more about threats to springs because in our region, but also across the entire West, there are a number of threats that would be very important for folks to know about. So it's been estimated that 90% of springs habitat has been lost. I've seen that in a number of different places, but no one has said since what date. So I'm just going to say of all time, it's estimated that 90% of habitat has been lost already. Some reasons for that include groundwater overdrafting and development, grazing and trampling by livestock, mining, pollution, climate change, invasive species, both plants and animals. And then there's also a threat in that there's a lack of information on these spring locations and conditions. And so yesterday, for instance, I was, like I said, in the Catalinas, which is a Sky Island just to the north of Tucson. And we were going to particular spring sites because we are doing some work, some restoration work at those after the fire. But on our way to one of those sites, we found 3 new springs that are not on any of our maps. And so whether those are now new springs because the fire changed the landscape and changed where plants were taking water out of the ground. And so maybe now a lot more of it is left in groundwater and that can flow and then emerge. I don't know the answer to that. But there are just so many of these sites that I think we don't even know about. So to be able to find out where they are and get some eyes on them, some boots on the ground to see what condition they're in is going to really help us work with some of these threats. So next I want to talk more about our Spring Seeker program because I mentioned it, but I want to show some examples of what that is because that's what I mostly work on. And maybe it'd be helpful in your regions as well to start collecting data in this way. So we have a bilingual mobile app and the only equipment required is your phone itself. We launched this program 2 months after the pandemic started. So we wanted to highlight that it is very easy to do social distancing. And we're finding that it takes people about 10 minutes to actually submit a spring survey. And it can be a lot longer depending upon how thorough the volunteers want to be. I definitely have been on other trips for other purposes and walked by a spring and very quickly as I'm, doing the other thing for the field trip or whatever it is that we're doing, take a few minutes and survey and document the spring. So it's something that is pretty variable depending on how people can actually how much time they actually have to use at a particular site. Just as an example, some of the questions that we ask have to do with how much water there is. So that's one of those. We also ask about human-made structures and kind of what those look like. They can be tanks and troughs, dams, anything that's evidence that people were there and were gathering the water. Human impacts like mining, pollution, trash. And we also ask about plants. And for each of the plants that we ask about, both natives and invasives, we have these little plant guides where people can click on it and they can judge, okay, yeah, I think that's fountain grass. I think that's brome. And we understand that we might not be getting perfect information, but for the most part, we're finding that our volunteers are incredibly thorough, and a lot of times they'll take photos, they'll save their survey and not submit it. They'll take photos and send it to me or someone else on our team and kind of say, hey, we think this is this plant. Can you confirm? And then I'll submit my survey. And so people are really taking this really seriously and are really trying to do a good job, even if they're not plant people or they're not, tadpole people or whatever else, to be able to identify the species that are out there. So what we're doing with the Spring Seeker data, we are finding and protecting water sources, like I mentioned. We're using the data to enhance habitat for wildlife, restore springs, control erosion. And then also one of the things we're finding, especially down at our work in Mexico, is that we thinking about creative ways to protect springs for mixed uses, recognizing that we do need to have cattle and other livestock accessing these sites, but we want to be able to protect the native plant communities and the wildlife communities that depend on that water, trying to figure out ways to work with ranchers in Mexico about that. And then, of course, we also provide reports on springs health to land managers, because we do work a lot with the Forest Service, and they would like to know who's still using our water, and the water rights documents that go back into the early 1900s, figuring out which of those springs are still being accessed and used. So with this, just to kind of summarize this up, so we have springs data from Arizona and Sonora. 600 springs, actually, I just rechecked the number this morning, and like I said, it's about 670 now, visited over the last couple of years. We're reaching out to landowners who may not know that they have springs on their property to figure out ways that we can collaborate with them. And then, of course, we're collaborating with a number of different agencies to be able to protect and restore these sites. And I do want to mention, because I know a lot of folks aren't based in the Sky Island region, that the Spring Stewardship Institute has a springs database called Springs Online. And this data set is kind of the global quintessential data source for springs. So if you are interested in plant conservation work at your local spring sites, connecting with the Spring Stewardship Institute is probably a smart move. And some of the other work we're doing around springs, we do have a spring restoration handbook. This is probably more effective for more dryland environments, but if you're interested in that, I'm happy to put my information in the chat afterwards, and anyone is welcome to reach out to me and I can share those documents. So that's all I was going to talk about for springs, but I do want to talk about the other major threat that is facing our region right now when it comes to the health of our biological communities, and that is the border wall. And so this is the southern part of Arizona, and politics aside, I'll show some pictures of what this wall looks like for the folks who maybe haven't been down in this region. I also recommend, if you haven't yet, we partnered with the New Yorker last week to release a documentary that's called American Scar, that really highlights the work that has been happening at the border and how it's been damaging the landscape. And I highly recommend it. It's only 13 minutes long, and then you're welcome to watch a panel discussion that we hosted last week. And like I said, I'll put that link in the chat as well. But yeah, so the border wall thus far has already reduced the number of wildlife migration corridors. So this map shows vehicle fence is this yellow type color here, and that's actually fairly passable to wildlife. It's those kind of Normandy type barriers. But then border wall that was built, the orange and red colors are ones that are pretty impassable to wildlife. And as you can see, a lot of that has been built very recently within the last 10 years or so. And so that is really highlighting how much change there has been across the border and permeability there. So the wall especially hurts large mammals, but also low-flying birds and endangered species that are trying to migrate through this corridor, including jaguars, ocelots, and gray wolves. There were about 60 new roads that were graded for Border Patrol to be able to access construction sites. So a lot of the water was wasted to be able to keep dust down. Trees and cacti and other plants were just bulldozed and removed. In some cases, they just bulldozed over drainages and filled that with material to be able to drive across it. And that means that water can't even get through anymore. A lot of groundwater pumping was done, which affects both our underground resources as well as springs to create concrete for the wall. And then also there's been a lot of lighting that has been put in along the border that has disrupted nocturnal species. I don't know the effect of lighting on plants, but I also imagine there might be something there, perhaps confusing pollinators or something else like that. So we also, of course, recognize that indigenous communities have also been affected because it's now an impassable barrier and it's disturbed or destroyed grave and cultural sites and infringes on native sovereignty. And so this feature, this border wall, is just such a huge impact to our region. I just want to share a couple of photos of that right now for folks who might not be as familiar with it to kind of, and I hope that as I show these, you kind of think through what that means for the biological communities that are in the area. So here's an example of road building that was done along the border. And you can see here, these are, bulldozers. And so you can really, the scale of this is just huge. Here's an example of a standing section of wall. And there actually are parts of the wall that are like this, where there's a wall for 200 feet and then there's nothing. And that's more passable for wildlife, certainly. But right now, Tucson Border Remediation, there's a plan to start filling in the gaps. And so there's, even though we have a new administration right now, there's still border wall being built in some places because they want to fill these gaps. But in fact, those gaps are what allow wildlife migration to still continue. Here's a completed section of wall, which you can see is just crossing our landscapes, and it's impassable to most wildlife. And a huge amount of blasting and bulldozing was done to build roads for access, which has irrevocably changed the plant communities as well in these areas. And just for comparison, this is a southern end of the Huachucas, where you can see the top picture is July 2020, but then 1 month later, when that road was built, just how quickly some of this has gone in and has been impacting our communities down there. And like I mentioned, I highly recommend the American Scar documentary. We also have an extensive section on our website on the border wall where we have some videos of animals trying to cross and trying to get through and being unable to. And so I highly recommend taking a look at all of that because it's going to be, if we are able to start doing some of the restoration work down there, it is going to be a very big project to recover that landscape. So those are kind of the main things I wanted to talk about. I did just want to, I'm happy to take some questions, but then also I want to kind of open it up with some ideas here. Like, I read through the National Seed Strategy and would love to think about ways to incorporate that more in restoration planning. If you have ideas around ways to get people inspired and excited about plants, I would love to hear that too, because I like plants, but I don't know how to get other people excited about that. So if you have ideas for that. And I mentioned this issue before, kind of protections for non-Rio-Crene springs are weak or non-existent in Arizona. And then with the border wall, these impacts on plant and animal communities and indigenous peoples. And those are just some of the things that are bouncing around in my head. I'd be happy to take some questions, or if you want to talk about any of those things, I would love to do so. And so with that, I am happy to open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Truebe. So I haven't heard that term Sky Islands before to refer to like the different elevational zones and the biodiversity and everything. So that's pretty cool. And I'm sure that term could be used lots of other places too. I also didn't know there were so many types of springs. It's a very unique niche that you're in, a unique field that's like really critical to these types of ecosystems. I mean, that's the lifeblood of them, right?
For sure. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. Also, one last thing I'll say before we get to questions is that I'm very surprised that the largest Native American fern in North America is actually found like in the Sonoran area. That's extremely surprising, but awesome. It just shows like what kind of diversity lies in those specific areas.
For sure, yeah.
And sure you throw in the links because we are excited to see about the documentary that's going on with the border wall, and also everything else you mentioned.
Yeah. So yeah, I did just put all those links in there. I also will put in my email real quick, and then I'm happy to take any additional ideas, thoughts, questions, whatever else comes up, even after this part of the presentation. But yeah, like definitely check out that American Scar documentary. It's just so remarkable, and it's one of those things that's happened largely out of view. But it's going to it already has had a huge impact on our communities down here.
100%, 100%. And also thanks for mentioning like the infringement on native sovereignty too. I think that's really important too, and glad that they're hitting that too. So, sorry, just a little. Okay, so there is one question in the chat. We have there been a reduction in groundwater extraction for humans, livestock, etc., that may explain the number of springs in this region?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't actually think the number of springs necessarily, other than like I kind of mentioned, maybe there's something from the fire, and that's why there's more right now. But
cutting out on my end.
Oh shoot. I wonder if my internet is getting iffy. Can you hear me now? Uh-oh, can you guys hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Okay, great. Okay. Uh-oh, I think maybe Alyssa froze. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I don't know for sure if the reduction in groundwater right now we're still overdrafting our groundwater pretty seriously. So I really think it actually has to do with the diversity of habitats that we have. And so we have all of this all this elevation variability, which means that we have a lot more places where there are impermeable layers next to permeable layers. And so that's the kind of interface that we need to get groundwater moving and then emerging at the surface. So I think that probably and actually we have a talk coming up, I'll try and grab the link for that too, on the geology and geomorphology of the Sky Islands, kind of talking through why we probably have such a variety there. So yeah, I don't know for sure. It's more that we just have so few rivers and lakes compared to other areas. Like we only get about 12 inches of rain per year. So I think that's really the main reason that springs are so important in this region, is just that we don't have a lot of other options.
Awesome. Thank you. Sorry, that was totally on my end, the breakup. You are frozen for me, Sarah, but I'm sure it's just me. I don't know if I'm frozen for you.
You are frozen as well.
Okay. So let's see. I am not seeing any other questions in the chat, but I have one question for you. So are there ways that you focus on different climate adaptation strategies or techniques in your work when you're doing restoration on the Sky Islands?
Yeah, so that would be one thing that I would love to do more of, because the idea is we're putting out some plantings to help stabilize slopes around springs in the Bighorn Fire area, but are we just planting species that won't be able to survive in 20 years? And so that is one thing that we have an eye on right now, but we also recognize that a lot of work that, like, even if we do something now that helps for the next 20 years, that will at least keep those slopes stabilized and will keep that material at the top of the mountain instead of in massive debris flows, like we had at the past time we had a very large fire in that area. So that kind of thing, we would like to incorporate more climate adaptation planning, but we also recognize kind of the importance of being able to do work where we can right now, and then adapting as we go. So I don't know if that's a really satisfying answer, but.
I mean, it's hard to have a satisfying answer, but yeah, I mean, you're doing what you can, and you, like you said, like just making sure it's still there, maybe in a different area if it can survive in a different area, but yeah. No, I appreciate that, and thank you for your presentation today. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. We loved the spring life photos, and we especially loved the plant photos and the species that you shared. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. This has been great, and by all means, please do check out that high elevation plants talk, because Dan does spring plants a lot more justice than I could in this talk today. So thank you so much.
Great, thanks. And just as a reminder to everyone that we are going to post that recording of her presentation on the PCA YouTube page, which I'm putting a link in the chat to right now. So yeah, reach out to her. She did post her email. Okay, so the next portion of the meeting, we are really ahead on time, like a half an hour, but that's okay. So we are going to do the native plants round table. So basically this is where we open up the floor to everybody who's might be interested in sharing information on national native plant or regional events and activities, new publications, or any other upcoming meetings. So to get the ball rolling, I'll start off with the 2022 California Native Plant Society Conference. That's coming up on October 20th through the 22nd, so this fall. The theme will be Rooting Together, Restoring Connections to Plants, Place, and People. You can sign up for updates on their meeting page, which will sorry, it's in a box, but yeah. So yeah, and then if anyone else has conferences or, you know, other upcoming events to share, please space. I'll give you guys a couple minutes. Or if no one has anything to share, oh.
Hey, Alyssa. This is Gary from the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. I will just mention that this coming Friday is our 19th Smithsonian Botanical Symposium. I've posted it on the listserv, but just in case you are interested and you have not registered yet, we are still taking registrations. It is a hybrid event, so we'll be in person and live at the Natural History Museum, and it'll be hybrid, virtual as well if you want to participate via Zoom. And so I will put a link in the chat, and that will hopefully allow you to learn more about it and sign on if you are interested. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. I was so excited because I was going to attend that hybrid or virtually, but since I ended up coming to this conference, it's going to be while I travel. So you said it was going to be recorded, or parts of it are?
The whole thing is going to be recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube a few weeks afterwards. So you'll get a chance to see it.
Yay. Okay, thank you for sharing, Gary. Does anyone else have any upcoming events or that they want to share? Okay. Well, are there any other anything else that you want to bring up in this space? Otherwise, our meeting is going to be very short. Okay. I will say that in terms of tribes, I do want to get the word out about the National Tribal and Indigenous Climate Conference. So it's not like specific to plants, but it's a really good space. It's kind of like the National Adaptation Forum, if any of you guys know about that, where, you know, we have tons of speakers, but it's especially for a tribal track for adaptation strategies that tribes are doing. Also, plenty of agency representatives will be there too. Here, I'll get the link to it. Well, I'll get it in a moment. And then other than that, if nobody wants to mention anything else, then we can just talk about when the next meeting will be.
This is Maggie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to mention that this is going to be my last Plant Conservation Alliance meeting as the coordinating botanist of the Plant Conservation Alliance because my contract is coming to an end. So just wanted to mention that, let everybody know.
Well, thank you so much, Maggie, for all of your help over this. I mean, I've only been a part of this group for a little while, but you've been an incredible help from what I can see to
so much.
We're sad to see you leave. Do you know what's next
I appreciate
yet?
that.
Or?
I'm joining the National Park Service as a biological technician at the Glen Canyon Recreation Area. First.
That's exciting. Well, congratulations on that, and good luck. And we wish you the best.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for your time today. I'll give you back, you know, the rest of your hour. The next PCA general meeting is going to be July 13th. Our speaker for that meeting will be Dr. Murphy Westwood of the Morton Arboretum, who's going to talk about the Global Tree Assessment Initiative and the state of native U.S. trees. So that will be exciting. Thank you guys so much for your time today, and I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your week. Thanks so much.
Thank you for that presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for hosting, Alyssa.